Italo Calvino is arguably one of the most important literary figures in Italian literature of the 20th century. He was an essayist, a writer, a critic, a publisher. He was even a partisan for some of the Second World War. And he is essentially a nodal point, a point of reference for engaging with a whole range of issues to do with Italian culture. So, for example, if you wanted to look at questions of authorship, of reading, of writing, of how Italian and European literatures interact, questions of Italian literary history, Calvino is a good point of reference. And not to mention the fact that he wrote to a great number of the active writers in his time because he was also a publisher and a critic. Now, his prose ranges from the early moment when in 1947 he writes Il sentiero di ragno, the path to spider's nest, which is a story about a child narrator who sees the partisan conflicts, something which is towards the tail end of what we call neorealism. He writes fantasy in the 1950s. He writes a story called Il Visconte dimezzato, perhaps even the science fiction moment of the 1960s with the unpronounceable protagonist. And there are experimental projects he has in the 70s as well, one of which is called Il Castello dei Destini Incrociati in 1973, which is the story of how protagonists create their stories by picking up and arranging tarot cards. In other words, bringing up the question of how we construct stories, arranging different elements. In 1979, which is the moment which he has a very important project, it's the hypernovel for Calvino, the Se una notte d'inverno un viaggiatore, which is the story of writing and finding a new book. In other words, you as the character are going on an adventure to find the full, complete work of Calvino's new novel, Se una notte d'inverno un viaggiatore. And the opening of the novel begins, you are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, sit back, relax, turn the TV off, and so on. Now, what's so important about this is that it's using a different mode of narration, something which you're not very familiar with necessarily. You might be familiar with first-person narration, where I will tell you the story of something, or third-person narration, or the story is going to be told to you, or there is no active presence of narrator. But you probably haven't come across second-person narration, where you as the reader are being compelled to follow the events of the plot. In other words, it's you as reader going on an adventure to discover where on earth this book is found, or to be found. And it's an adventure which goes in and out of all kinds of levels of narration, and it is sometimes considered Calvino's masterpiece. So there's no single term which we can use to define his output. But his essays are also very important for how we consider reading. For example, he writes a very famous essay called Perché leggere I classici, or Why Read Classics? And it's an essay which discusses different definitions of what it means to read a classic, but also what we get out of it. And it's a particularly important question to ask for anyone studying literature, whether it's English literature, German, French, Italian, Spanish, and so on, at university. Because behind the idea of having a syllabus and reading important canonical works in whatever national tradition, we also have to ask the question, why are we reading those specific books? Why has someone chosen these to be important? What do we get out of them? And one of the definitions that Calvino suggests is that a classic is a work that is never finished saying what it has to say. Now, on the one hand, you might suggest that that just says that you as a reader miss something the first time you read it. And to some extent that's true. Perhaps even there are layers of complexity beneath the first reading which we only gain every next time that we read it. But also it suggests implicitly that we as readers mature, we become more capable of reading beyond simply the surface of a text. And that is a really important way in which we approach literary studies at university. And it's also one of the reasons why Calvino is important for studying Italian literature, but also literature more generally at university.